You weren't here last year?
I was, but I didn't see it.
Oh, okay. All right.
I didn't see it.
We are going to read Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal. A Tale of Tattletales. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales.
They're all tattletales? Are you serious?
It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Peter pulled my pigtail. That must have hurt, Mrs. McNeil said. Did you tell Peter that? Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, let's see what Peter has to say. Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Jessica says you pulled her pigtail, Mrs. McNeil said. I did not, Peter said. Yes, you did, Jessica said. You both have the right to say how you feel, Mrs. McNeil said. You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules, like keep your hooves to yourself, make it easier to do that. Mrs. McNeil added, but since Jessica's tail is still attached, and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now. Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming, the farmer in the dell, the farmer in the dell. Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel. Maybe her ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out. Put your shoe on, please. Stephen can't find his pink marker, Mrs. McNeil said. Have you seen it? I gave it back, Rachel cried. I can't find my pink marker. That's because you used it all up, Peter said. You're always drawing pictures of pigs. Rachel sniffed. For your information, those are pictures of Moy. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green? You know our class rule, Rachel, said Mrs. McNeil. If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends.
Yeah, that's very mean.
Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, Frankie called Sookie a fat sow. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. I'm glad you know our class rules so well, Mrs. McNeil said. You're right, we don't call each other names. Also, we don't try and fix problems that don't belong to us, Mrs. McNeil said. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Sookie have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeil added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have.
No, you need to take care of others.
Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then...
We have to take care of each other.
The stampede started. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Laura looked at me. Jeremy's grunting. I can't concentrate. She's picking his snout.
Okay. Looking at you.
The students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list. A very important rule, Mrs. McNeil added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeil shouted. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling. And I know you know what that is.
Yeah. I was thinking of getting time.
Some students looked at the floor, some students looked at each other, some looked at the ceiling like they are suddenly seeing something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here is our new class rule. What does it mean? Jessica asked. It says, don't squeal unless it's a big deal. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems, and they can work them out themselves. Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other.
Yeah,
But sometimes, Mrs. McNeil said, something happens that's bigger than a kid problem. Like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them, or that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about that problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Caroline's fault, Sookie said. Who's Caroline? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Thump. Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick! Call the office! Tell them it's an emergency! Somebody get the nurse! Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door! Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed so much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad. It's all of our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
It sounds like all of you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt. And you're such good listeners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal.
What's a deal? A deal? No, a deal.
The end.
Meal? Deal. Deal? What is that?
What is RED